We are particularly honored this afternoon to hear from Sara McLanahan, the William S. Todd Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs here at Princeton, and the author of more than 100 scholarly articles and of 5 books, most recently, Fathers Under Fire. The director of the Bentheim-Thoman Center for Research on Child Well-Being, Professor McLanahan is a prominent researcher in the fields of family demography, poverty and inequality, and social policy regarding children and families. Her current research is on the phenomenon of fragile families, unmarried couples with children. Professor McLanahan's presentation today, running 45 to 50 minutes, followed by a discussion with you all, will consider the results of a study that has followed such fragile families since the year 2000. Please join me in welcoming Sara McLanahan.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Can everyone hear me just fine? When I'm going through some of these slides, if you have any sort of questions about sort of didn't understand the slide or factual questions, please stop me so I can deal with them then. I think we should wait till the end of the lecture before we get into the broader, bigger questions. But I don't want to go flying past something that didn't make sense when I showed it to you. So please stop me. So what I'm going to be talking about today is, this is a little map of the talk. I'm going to talk about the growth of fragile families, the causes of the growth. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Fragile Family Study that I've been directing for the last 5 years, and some of the lessons learned from that study. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what might be done to make things better. So the first question, what are fragile families and why do we care about them? So fragile families are defined as unmarried parents with children. They're fragile in terms of both their economic situation and their social relationships, so hence the name fragile families. They're also families in terms of both their biological and social ties. We care about them because there's been a very dramatic increase in these children born to unmarried parents since 1965, and I'll show you some slides about this in just a minute. There's also very large disparities in these trends by race, ethnicity, and by education. So they're really this is not a phenomenon that's affecting all Americans equally. And then finally, there's quite a bit of evidence, and I think maybe Brad Wilcox talked about some of this earlier, that the links between these families and the well-being of children and the future intergenerational well-being of the next generation. So that's why we care. So first, here's just a slide that shows you the trends in non-marital birth rates in the U.S. Going back to 1940. So the yellow line is all births, the red line is births to non-whites, and the blue line is births to whites. So African Americans and Hispanics are combined in this trend line of the red or the pink, and that's because we didn't start really keeping track of Hispanics until pretty late, so this is a nice way of combining them. So I think the main thing to see here is that these trends have been increasing for all groups since the 1960s, really. They really started going up in the 60s. They started higher for the minority groups, and therefore they're still higher today, but the overall pattern of the increase is the same for all the groups. That little decline after 95 in the red line is due to the decline in teenage childbearing, which until very recently, there's quite a nice decline in teenage childbearing during the 90s, although that decline has stopped, and there's a little bit of evidence now that it may be going back up. But as I'll show you in a minute, teenage childbearing is very correlated with non-marital childbearing. And so when the teenage childbearing goes down, that's going to be a signal that the non-marital childbearing will go down also. Here's another picture that shows the disparity this is using the census data that looks at the proportion of single mothers with a child 1 year old or less. So this is pretty much unmarried mothers. This is sort of the best data that we can get that will let us look at these trends by education. So you can see at the bottom there, the yellow line, this is the Murphy Browns. These are the women with the high education, the professional women having children out of wedlock. And you can see that that number has never been very high and has actually gone down since 1990. So it's less than 10% of these women this particular number is for the top quarter of the education distribution. So it's not even as high. If you were to pull the professional women or the women with college degrees out of this, the number would be even lower. On the other hand, at the top are the women in the bottom quintile of the education distribution. You can see for them, this has been a huge phenomenon. And you can also see that the women in the middle group, the middle two groups, the second and third quartiles of the education distribution, have also experienced very large increases in the non-marital childbearing since 1960. Here's a picture of what's going on in other countries. So as you can see here, the yellow line is 1998 and the blue line is 1980. So this gives you a sense of how much non-marital childbearing is growing in all of these industrialized countries. You can see here, with the exception of Japan, which is where there's hardly any of this, all of these countries have experienced an increase in children born to unmarried parents in that 20-year period. You can also see that the US is not the highest. We're not an outlier in this respect. The Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, all have a greater percent of children born outside wedlock. But actually, I don't have the slide here, but one point I want to make here is that these numbers can be very misleading in terms of what's really going on in the families, because in the Scandinavian countries, to take Sweden for an example, you have here over 50% of children are born to unmarried parents in Sweden. However, 90% of those parents are cohabiting. And cohabiting parents in Sweden have about the same stability rates as married parents in the US. So in Sweden, non-marital childbearing is, even though the parents aren't married, the relationships between the parents are pretty stable. And so one question I wanted to address when I started this study of fragile families was sort of what's going on in the US and how similar are we to the Scandinavian model, or is something else going on here? So I'll talk just a little bit about the causes of this large increase in non-marital childbearing. And let me just say here that there's a lot of debate about this, and no one has completely nailed this down. There's a lot of theories and a lot of evidence to support different theories, and there's also evidence that sort of challenges the different theories. So I'll talk just a minute or two about what these theories are, and you can keep them in your back of your head when I'm showing you some of the evidence that we have from the Fragile Family Study. So one of the most popular arguments about why this increase in non-marital childbearing has occurred is that it's due to the increase in women's economic status that sort of began in the 60s and related to the delay in marriage, and increases in women's education, increases in women's labor force participation. And the argument here is that women had more economic resources, and therefore they could afford to support a family on their own and a child on their own. Now, the problem with this argument, as you can see earlier, the women with the most education, or who are most able to support a child on their own, are actually the least likely to have a child outside marriage. So right on the face of it, you can see that this may be part of what's going on, but there must be more to the story than just the increase in women's economic independence. Another argument that's very common among sociologists is that this has to do with the decrease in men's economic position, which made them less marriageable. And this is a theory that's been proposed by William Julius Wilson, who's a prominent sociologist at Harvard. And he's really focusing on what's happened to the economic resources of the men at the bottom of the income distribution. So his argument goes that these men during the 70s and 80s, because of deindustrialization and changes in the labor market, really lost their access to good jobs, large increases in unemployment and non-employment, and these men were just not able to support families anymore, that they just weren't what he called marriageable men. And so therefore, the women didn't want to marry them. Now, there's a lot of evidence that what he says about what's happened to the economic trajectory of the men at the very bottom of the education distribution. There's lots of evidence that that's true. However, that argument doesn't explain why women continue to have children even though the men that they might have partnered with weren't marriageable. I mean, you might have thought, well, that they would have stopped having children, or they would have at least waited until they could find a man who was marriageable. A third argument that you hear, or used to hear, is that the rise in welfare benefits that occurred after the mid-60s made sort of poor single women able to raise a child on their own. So sometimes this argument is put together with the decline in the men's ability to support a family. So sometimes you hear, on the one hand, the men couldn't support the family. On the other hand, the women had access to these growing welfare benefits, and therefore they just had these children outside marriage. Now, there is an enormous amount of empirical research that has looked at this welfare effect, so-called welfare effect. And in order to look at that, they compare welfare benefits in different states of the Union, and they look at whether or not the states with the most generous benefits are more likely to have non-marital births than the states with the least generous benefits. And the correlations are very, very weak here. There's just not much empirical evidence for this theory. I mean, to just think of it, the easiest way to think of it is the state with the worst, lowest welfare benefits is Mississippi. And that state probably has one of the very highest non-marital birth rates. So the welfare argument just, doesn't really do the trick either. So a couple of other arguments that probably have more to do with what you're interested in. So there is this argument that there was the shift in norms about sex outside marriage and sort of a decline in the stigma associated with sex outside marriage that made single motherhood and non-marital childbearing more acceptable. Now, the problem with that argument is that it doesn't explain, again, this SES gradient. It doesn't explain the fact that there's such a big difference between what the highly educated and the low educated women are doing. Usually when there's a change in norms, and we were talking about earlier when divorce rate first started going up, when there's a change in norms, it's usually the most educated group that adopts the kind of innovation first, and it sort of trickles down to the less educated groups. But in here you can see that this is not the case at all with this non-marital childbearing, which suggests that this isn't just about new norms. A related argument has to do with the change in birth control technology, which came out in the 60s, the pill, really, primarily, which came out in the pill. And the argument here is that this really reduced women's bargaining power over sex and marriage. And according to this argument, in the old days, if a woman agreed to have sex before she was married with her boyfriend, her partner, or her fiance, it was understood by both partners that if she did get pregnant, that he would marry her. And so you had a lot of shotgun marriages in the 50s and in the early 60s. The idea is that after this birth control technology changed, the assumption sort of shifted that preventing pregnancy was the woman's responsibility. It really wasn't up to the man anymore. It was her responsibility, and therefore he wasn't responsible for marrying and taking responsibility for the child if she should become pregnant. You might sort of combine that argument with this idea that there was this shift in the norms about the sex outside marriage, and that this made it sort of easier for the men to sort of say, look, what's the deal? Why shouldn't you have sex with me? Other women are all doing it. There's no big stigma against it. And on the one hand, if the girl did get pregnant, she wasn't able to get him to the promise of marriage. Now again, that argument about the change in birth control still doesn't explain, if the men weren't willing to marry the girl if she were to get pregnant, why did she have children anyway? Why didn't she just say, well, then I'm not having sex, or I'm not having children? Why didn't she hold out like the more educated women did? The only answer that I can give you to that sort of those two questions where I say why, when the men's wages went down, or when the shift in norms really changed women's bargaining power, why did the women keep having the children? And there's an interesting book called Promises I Can Keep by Kathy Eden and Maria Kafalis, where they interviewed a lot of low-income single mothers. And the argument that they come up with is that these poor women feel like having a child and being a good mother is something they can do, and they want to do it. And they're much less certain about whether they can find a man to share this with them. And so they're just not willing to give up the role of motherhood. It's not clear to them that they're going to be able to get a man to share that with them. And so they just choose to have the children while they continue to look for the perfect partner. Okay, so that's sort of the backdrop to what was going on in the mid-90s in terms of the academic debates about this phenomena. And at that point is when we decided that we wanted to do this study of these unmarried couples, the fragile families. And so that we had 4 general questions in mind when we started this study. The first question was, what are the parents' capabilities, especially the fathers? It turned out that we knew a little bit about the mothers. We had some information from vital statistics data on the births, and we also had some information from large nationally representative fertility surveys. So we sort of knew what the characteristics of the mothers in terms of age and education and race were. But we really didn't know anything about the fathers. We didn't really know about their ability to pay. Were they really these very, very unmarriageable men? What were they like? Could these men be good fathers? There were a lot of stories out there. These men are violent. These men, they couldn't possibly have a relationship. We wouldn't want these women to be married to these men. So there was lots and lots of stories based on either speculation or very small qualitative studies that would just go into one community and do some research. So we really wanted to get a sense of, if we had a representative sample of these unmarried fathers, exactly what is their potential. The second question, probably the most important, was what is the nature of these parents' relationship? So I mentioned a minute ago that the Scandinavian countries had these very high levels, higher than in the US, higher levels of non-marital childbearing. But it looked like most of those relationships were pretty stable. And the proportion of children in Sweden who lived with a single mother by age 15 is much, much lower than it is in the US. So a lot of people were arguing that this non-marital childbearing in the US is not a big deal. It's just a shift in it's a secularization and moving away from having the church sort of condone the union as marriage, but it's still a very stable union, and we shouldn't be interfering with these people's lives. The children are fine, and we just shouldn't be bothering about that. That was one argument. On the other extreme were arguments, and you'd sometimes see this in the op-ed pages of the New York Times, that these children were the outcome of one-night stands. The father didn't even know that the woman was pregnant. The mother doesn't even know who the father is. So there was a range of speculation about what the nature of the relationship was, running from very, very casual to really quite committed. And we, again, wanted to figure out on a representative sample of the population what exactly is going on. Third, we wanted to know what happened to these relationships over time. Were they, in fact, stable? Were they marriage-like? Were they committed? What kinds of factors kept the parents together, and what kinds of factors pushed them apart? And then finally, we wanted to know what happened to the parents and the children, because obviously that was the primary concern, was that, if all that really matters is that this is just parents doing something a different way, as a researcher, my concern with children would really be less. But if, in fact, the children were really suffering from these relationships, that would be something that my colleagues and I would want to know. So we decided to do a study of these parents. There is a list. You can get a list of all the non-marital births in the country. The Vital Statistics has that list, although it takes about 3 years for them to actually put all that data together. But we could have gone out and sampled from the Vital Statistics records. We could have gotten a sample of new unmarried parents. But instead, we decided to go and sample them at the hospitals. And we did that for for really two reasons. First of all, we wanted to get them right at the time of birth, and we thought that if we went to the hospital, we'd be able to have better luck at getting the parents to participate in the survey. It would also be cheaper because they're all in one place. They're sitting there at the hospital, and that's a lot cheaper than having to go out and sample from a birth records and then go out and try to find all these people. And indeed, it was true. The Department of Education has recently done a birth cohort survey, and they got about 75% of the births that they sampled from vital statistics. They got about 75% of the mothers to participate in the study, whereas we were able to get almost 90% by going into the hospital. So we went to the hospitals between 1998 and 2000. We went into 75 hospitals in 20 different cities. And we actually went into the hospital. We went into each city. Before we started, we got information from the vital statistics to see where the births, which hospitals in a city the births were occurring in. And if a hospital had no births, we eliminated it. Or if it had hardly any non-marital births in some of the very large cities, we eliminated that. But for the most part, we went into every hospital in our 20 cities, or in a few cases like New York City and Chicago, which were both in our sample, we had to sample hospitals in those two cities because there's so many hospitals. But in most cases, we went into every hospital. When the woman had the child, we went to the room. Actually, in some of the hospitals that produced a lot of births, we sampled beds in the hospital. So then we went to when a woman appeared in 9A, we would go to her and ask and do a little interview to see if she met our criteria. And our criteria was that she'd had a baby, the baby had a living father, she was going to keep the child, not put the child up for adoption. And then we deliberately oversampled non-marital births. So we have a sample of married parents in the survey just so we could do some comparisons. But 3/4 of the people in our sample were non-married. So once we kind of got to our quota of marital births, we stopped and we just kept screening mothers until we got the non-marital births. Then after we interviewed the mother, we asked her about the father, and we asked could we interview him. And this was probably the most innovative and successful part of the survey because in the past, nobody had been able to get these fathers or anything near a representative sample of these fathers to participate in the survey. But the men come to the hospital to see the babies, and they're very proud about the babies. So we got about 75% of the unmarried fathers to do our interview at birth, and then we continued to follow these families, and by the 3rd year, we had interviewed about 85. At least one time we'd had an interview with about 85% of the unmarried fathers. So that we feel like we've probably got the best sample. These data probably has the best sample of unmarried fathers that you can get in the US. So we interviewed the parents at birth, then we followed up and did second interviews when the child was 1 year old, 3 years old, and 5 years old. And at 3 and 5, we went to the mother's home. And we did in-person interviews with the mother, and we did child assessments. So we did some cognitive testing on the child, and the interviewers observed the mothers interacting with the children. And we got a little bit of information on the nature of the home and the child's environment. So we're currently in the field now with the 9-year wave of this study. So I feel like the study has sort of become, this is like my family, you know. And the children are 9 years old, and we're trying to find them, the parents, and to interview them again. One thing that's kind of neat about the study is it's what researchers call multi-methods. So it includes these telephone interviews with the parents. It includes the in-person interviews. We've also got birth record information. We went back in about half the cases, we were able to go back to the hospital and attach information from the mother's birth record to the case. We also had these child assessments, which I mentioned a minute ago, which are done where they look at the children's cognitive tests, and they ask them some numbers sort of questions. And then finally, we took 75 couples from 3 cities, and we did in-depth qualitative interviews. And and longitudinal follow-up interviews with these 75 couples. Because some of the people that we talked to when we were first presenting our results were sort of wondering, well, are these parents really telling you the truth when they fill out these surveys, or maybe they're just putting you on? And so the qualitative researcher, in fact, the woman I mentioned ago who wrote the book about Promises I Can Keep, she led a team of researchers, and including some students, graduate students at Northwestern, that did the follow-up interviews with these parents. And they did they did an interview with the mothers separately from the father. And then they also did an interview with them together to make sure that they weren't just sort of saying things because they were with one another. I'll tell you a little bit about what we learned from all of these kinds of data. So in sum, this is a nationally representative sample of births to unmarried parents in large cities. The only part of this that's not representative of the U.S. is that in order to be in our sample, you had to have a birth in a city of 200,000 or more. And so that, is not, we don't cover births in rural areas or births in suburban hospitals. A lot of people in suburbs do come into the cities to have their babies, and they would be in our survey. But this, as far as I know, is the best sort of sample that we have. And I should also point out that if any of you are interested in using the data, they're public. We have a website. You can Google Fragile Families, actually. And the study comes up, and there's all kinds of papers. There's about several hundred papers have been written from the study. And if you want to get the data and do your own study, that's okay too. Yeah?
Ma'am, I have a study design question.
Yes.
Are there enough babies born outside of hospitals? They're only counting babies born inside hospitals to introduce some sort of selection bias?
Yeah, that's a good question. Very, very few babies are born outside of hospitals, so we do miss them, though. And I don't think that's probably nearly as serious as sort of not getting the births in the suburbs or in the rural areas. But it is it's we do miss them. Also, if you had a birth in a hospital where hardly any non-marital births occurred, you wouldn't be because in some of these large cities we excluded those hospitals, like in New York City when we were sampling. We didn't want to end up going into a hospital that really wasn't producing very many non-marital births. It turns out that in cities like New York and Philadelphia, which were in our sample, most of the even highly educated women, have their hospitals in have their babies in the big hospitals like Columbia Presbyterian and University of Pennsylvania. And so these hospitals are very heterogeneous in terms of the class of the mother. So I don't really worry that we're missing Murphy Brown because those women are all having their babies in sort of different hospitals. But that is a bit of a concern. Okay, so the lessons learned. So this is sort of my basic argument, and then I'll spend a lot more time kind of going over each piece of this. So at birth, I'm going to argue that these people have very positive views about marriage. So they're not rejecting marriage. They've got high hopes for the future together, and there's some evidence that they're fairly committed. So these are not one-night stands, most of these births. However, there is wide acceptance of single motherhood, and there is also the parents' capabilities. This speaks to the marriageable male hypothesis. The parents' capabilities are very low, and sexual fidelity is a serious issue for these couples. And I'll say more about that later too. Over time, what you have in these families, despite the fact that they have these high hopes at the beginning, is you have a lot of instability, a lot of turnover in relationships, and a lot of growing complexity in these families. And this instability and complexity affects the parents' ability to provide quality parenting, and that in turn lowers child well-being. So I'll go over this and each piece of this now. So first, the high hopes at birth. This is the good news. So if you ask these parents, and here this is a question that's asked in a lot of surveys, and it goes something like, marriage, the traditional marriage is better for children than being raised by a single parent. I mean, this is a kind of ideal. What's the best type of arrangement for a child. And I've got it here, I've divided this into 4 groups. The red group are the married parents, mothers and fathers. The yellow group are the parents who are, the unmarried parents who are living together at the time of the birth, the cohabiting parents. The visiting parents are the ones who are romantically involved, but they're not living together. But they are dating, they are still thinking they might get together. And the blue bar is the parents that have no relationship, no romantic relationship at the birth. In a minute, I'll show you what that distribution looks like. But just for now, if you can see here that, yes, married parents sort of think are a little more likely to think marriage is better than the 3 groups of unmarried parents. But all of the unmarried parents are over 60% in terms of thinking that marriage is better for kids. And the fathers are even more positive than the mothers. So, it doesn't look like from this type of question that these parents are sort of rejecting the institution of marriage. Oh yeah, all right.
Sorry, can you
Yeah.
just explain what do you mean by no relationship? Like a one-night stand or what?
Yeah, I have a slide I'll show you in a second. But it really means some of them are friends, but they're not in a sexual relationship. So they're not in a romantic relationship. Obviously they were at some point. Right, yeah, so this is not, some miracle. Yeah.
The category of married, are those the couples that were married before they had the children, or does this include couples that?
Married afterwards?
Yes.
No, this is birth. So this is at the birth of the child, all that I'm showing you right now. And remember I said we included married couples in the sample, just so we'd be able to compare them in some other dimensions. Okay. So here's another question. We asked them, what are your chances of marriage? Now this we just asked for the parents who weren't married, obviously. And so you can see here that if you add up the almost certain, pretty good, 50-50, you've got, a very high percent of the unmarried parents think they're probably going to get married to each other. This isn't just marriage in general. This is married to the father of this child. Again, the fathers are more positive than the mothers. The mothers are a little skeptical of some of these guys. And you see down at the bottom, the mothers, 17% of the mothers say no chance. But only 5% of the fathers. Now, part of that is due to, remember I told you earlier we got 90% of the mothers to be in the survey, but we only got 75% of the fathers at the hospital to be in the survey. So the fathers that we got were obviously the men who were a little bit more attached to the mother. In fact, I think they were using us to try to help win over the mother. So they're the men that, have the highest hopes. But even if we limited this comparison to couples for whom we had an answer from the mother and the father, so it's couples now, we've got exactly the same, it's still high, the men are still more positive than the women, at least among this group of fathers that we interviewed.
And they're asked separately.
Oh yeah, at the hospital the interview is done separately, right, yes, definitely. It's a little hard because you've got most of these people are in hospital rooms where there's another, a bed. But the interview that this is coming off with only lasted about 35 minutes. And it's sort of, we had a little bit of a problem because some of the women were leaving the hospital so fast. So we would go in and we would do the screener to make sure that they qualified for the study, which were the restrictions that they were going to keep the child and the father was living, because we really wanted to follow these relationships. And then we would go back with the interviewer to try to do the interview, and the mother would have checked out of the hospital. So we had some problems with that. Okay, here's the pie I probably should have showed you to start with. These are all the unmarried parents, and this is at birth. So this shows what percent of them were cohabiting. So you can see 51% of these parents were living together at birth. So another 32% were what we call visiting, and that's the ones who are romantically involved. So we didn't say, are you having sex? We said, how would you describe your relationship? And we would say we're romantically involved, we're just friends, or a no relationship. So those are the categories we used and the parents responded. So you can see in those little yellow and red pie slices that of the no relationship group, now remember before I had those were that dark blue, that they're about 17% are in no relationship. About half of them say they're just friends, and the other half say they have little or no contact with the father. But overall, this is a pretty, this means about 82 to 83% of these parents are romantically involved at the time that their child is born. And this was, believe me, a huge shock to most demographers, to most people in the policy world, to hear this, to realize that this was, it's not Sweden, it's not 90%, it's 51% cohabiting, but that so many of these couples had something going. They had some hopes of making this relationship last. And actually, this study was one of the motivations for doing the marriage initiatives. I don't know if you've talked about that in this meeting or not, but there's been a big marriage initiatives out there in the policy world, and they're being evaluated now, and that are trying to. There's a big program that's called Building Strong Families that are very that are aimed at these couples, getting them together, helping them keep their relationship going, and helping them marry. And Building Strong Families was very much sort of motivated by the fact that so many of these couples appeared to want to get married or want to be together. And the last sort of indicator of the commitment in this couple are these questions about the father involvement. Again, this is all, we get all of this information from the birth of the child, at the time of the birth. So very high percentage of the father bought things for the child during the pregnancy, helped in other ways. 88% visited the mother in the hospital. These are all unmarried fathers now. None of the married fathers are in this. The mother says the child will have the father's surname. The father's name is on the birth certificate. The mother says the father told her he wants to be involved. And last, and probably most importantly, the mother wants him to be involved. So this also spoke very strongly to a lot of people in the welfare community that were objecting to the marriage programs on the basis that these men were no good, they were violent, the women didn't want them around, and we shouldn't be trying to keep these couples together or promote marriage in any way. And so one of the things this tells you is that regardless of what the nature of this relationship is, and the mothers want these men involved in the lives of their children. And so so they're going to probably be more or less involved, at least for a while. So if you want to intervene on that relationship and have any impact on the quality of it, you need to be serving this population. Okay, so that's the good news. So the bad news is very strong belief that a single mother can raise a child alone. Again, the red bar, that's the marrieds. The marrieds are back into this question. So when the questions had to do with sort of just general norms or attitudes, we asked the marrieds as well as the unmarrieds. When it had to do about your relationship, are you going to get married? What are your chances? Then we limit it to the unmarried parents. So as you can see, a very high support for the idea that a single mother can raise a child alone. So this is a different sort of question than what's the best arrangement? So the best arrangement may be marriage, but can the single mother do it? Yes, the mothers, almost all these unmarried mothers think that she can do it. Even the 50%, even over 50% of the married mothers answer that a single mother can raise a child alone. And of course, not surprisingly, a lot of these mothers were raised by a single mother or a divorced mother at some point. See, the fathers are much less sure that the mother can raise the child alone. And that's because partly the fathers know that that means he's out of the picture. If the mother's going to raise the child alone, that means he's probably not going to have as much access to the child. So here's the picture of the capabilities. Remember I told you at the beginning we were very interested in the characteristics of the fathers, and nobody really knew very much about what the characteristics of these fathers were and how their characteristics compared to married parents. So if you look at age, you can see that the unmarried parents, just look at the mothers for a while, they're younger than the married parents. Only 25% of the unmarried mothers are teen mothers. However, in parentheses, I've showed you the number for the first births, the mothers who are giving a first birth. So remember, we went into the hospital and we just took any birth that occurred in this room, in this bed. Some of them were first births, about 40% were first births, and others were higher order births. So if you limit the sample to the first births, you begin to see that a lot of these mothers who are unmarried start their fertility as teens. They may not be a teenager when they have their second or third child outside marriage, but they started as, well, less than half, 42%. Then we have some information on the education of the parents. As you can see, it's practically the opposite picture for the married and the unmarried. The unmarried parents, very large percent of them have no high school degree. And very few percent, 1% have a college degree. The picture's exactly the reverse for the married parents. So very few of them have no high school degree, very high percent have a college degree. So same picture in general for the fathers. So this tells you, this is very consistent with this argument about the marriageable men, and that these men are really poor, they're really disadvantaged, and so are the women. But the fact here is that these two groups of people are coming from very different worlds. These are two very different populations. These unmarried parents are very poor, their human capital is very poor. Interestingly, the immigrants are actually slightly more represented among the marrieds than the unmarrieds. So that's sort of interesting. Look up at the third row down, the child with another partner, because this turns out to be very important. This is a phenomenon now that sociologists and demographers are talking about, and it's called multi-partnered fertility. It's literally a new term that's been created to describe what's been found in this study. So what we found was that of the unmarried mothers, 42% of them were living with a child who had a different father than the baby that they just had. And in parentheses, that is limited to the mothers who actually have a second child. In other words, if you're having your first child, you couldn't have multi-partner fertility. So, but if you limit that population to mothers who have had a second child or more, 68% of them have a second child with another father. Now this is going to relate back to what I talked about earlier as the complexity. Remember earlier I said that instability and complexity. So these families are, I call this multi-partner fertility, this is very complex because it means that when you're running your household, it's like in the simplest version, it's like a step family. And everybody knows now that step families are much harder to run than a traditional two-parent biological parent, because you're having to organize child support coming in from this dad and visitation with this dad. Well, you can imagine a situation in which, what if you had 3 children and 3 different fathers? Even if all those men were paying some child support and were being committed to their child, the whole idea of running that kind of a company, just think about the time spent trying to organize all of that, the scheduling, the getting this payment, that payment, and then of course, not to mention, there's all kinds of evidence that when another man's child is living with a mother, a father doesn't like contributing money to the household because he's not sure it's going to go to his child. And so you have those kinds of issues. So this multi-partner fertility is a new phenomena. It's very complex, and I think it has a lot to do, we're just beginning to study it, but I think it has a lot to do with why these unmarried couples have a much harder time making it. On the next page, there are just some differences in terms of mental health and health behaviors. So as you can see, the unmarried parents are a little more likely to be depressed. They have a little more heavy drinking, more drug use, and then this one shows at least one parent has a problem, both have a problem. The last row is especially striking. This was another big discovery of the study. 40% of these unmarried fathers have been incarcerated. Now, we knew that incarceration had been going up dramatically since the early 80s. We knew that phenomenon was taking place. We also knew that a lot of the men who were incarcerated had families and were fathers, but we never had sort of this kind of a picture of, well, what does this mean from the child's point of view? How many of the children born are being born to fathers who've been incarcerated? And this incarceration is very important because incarceration has been shown to reduce men's earnings. It reduces their ability to get a job. It reduces their ability to be in public housing projects. Very often if a man has a prison record, he's not eligible, or his family isn't eligible for certain benefits if he's with them. And most importantly, which we'll come to in a minute, if you think that the couple relationship, that part of the problem is the nature of the quality of the relationship between these parents, which is what the marriage program, now the marriage initiatives that the Bush administration is funding, if you think they're trying to improve the quality of relationships, communication, negotiation, anger management, all of these kinds of things, can you imagine a worse place to send a young man to be trained in relationship quality than a prison? I mean, that is, the training ground there. What the skills he's learning there, the interpersonal skills, are just the opposite of what it takes to be a good father and a good partner and a good husband. So this was a big surprise. About 20% of that 40% of those men are in jail because of some sort of a violent crime. The other 80%, some of it's property crime, but a lot of it's drug kind of crime. So we've had large changes in our prison policies since the early 80s. We're putting more people in jail for drug crime, and we're keeping them there longer. And now you can see how this is playing out on the children and their relationships. Yeah.
I just have one question about something on the previous slide about the MPF, was it?
Yes,
Yeah.
multi-partner fertility.
So were you at all surprised that it's so high for married couples? I mean, what exactly is
Yeah, that must be from the step fam. Those must be, people who've been married and they're now having a child with a second partner.
Okay.
Which is I was surprised it was that high. Okay, now to the trust. So this is a big issue. Men cannot be trusted to be faithful. We ask the women, a man is out to take advantage of a woman. So you can see here that this distrust is much higher among the unmarried parents, especially the parents who've ended their relationship. So they've been burned. They feel very distrustful. It's about 10% of the married parents, but 45% of the mothers who've ended their relationship. Then I'll tell you a little bit about, we did some of the follow-up on these trust questions in the qualitative interviews that we did with the parents. And over half of the unmarried couples reported infidelity, both chronic and sporadic in these interviews. Infidelity was higher among the men than the women. 75% of these couples, when we talked about the relationship, mentioned problems with jealousy. And this issue was higher among the women. The other point to make is that the infidelity and jealousy were mentioned just as often as the economic problems, in terms of when we asked these parents about their relationship and what were the problems and what were they waiting for to get married. Because they say they want to get married, so what's the problem? Well, very much the can I trust him in the sexual fidelity. Yeah.
Are these statistics from the third year or the first?
This is slightly different. This is early on. Yeah, this is early on. This is, we started these qualitative interviews about 2 months after the baseline. And they actually went for about a 24-month period. So this could have occurred any time within that period. So there's a book that Kathy Eden and Paula England have put out that's called Unmarried Couples with Children. And it's a set of chapters of qualitative, of chapters describe using the qualitative research to talk about these couples' relationship. And if any of you are interested in that, I can tell you more about that in a minute. But there's a lot in there about the couple jealousies and the conflicts. So you can see now that, yes, William Julius Wilson was right about these men having very poor economic prospects. And the parents do talk about the economic barriers to marriage. But this is another piece of it. Along with the economic problems, there are these sexual and distrust problems. Now, the other piece, and this is where the multi-partnered fertility comes back in, this having children with the other partner makes everything worse on this front. We thought at first that the women were going to be upset because their new partner was paying child support to an old household. So we thought that would be a source of conflict, but it wasn't. The conflict was over him going to visit that other child. And the reason was he was going to visit the mother. And so there's actually a word for this. It's called the baby mama drama. And they all knew. I mean, the people in the interview, they told us, oh, it's the baby mama drama. Yeah, every time he goes over there, he hears this woman, he had a sexual relationship, he's now going back, he's going back to see the child, and perhaps he has 2 children in 2 different households. So not only is this multi-partner fertility creating just administrative costs of running such a household and arranging the child support and the time with fathers, it's also a huge source of jealousy and mistrust. And when the parents are sort of having a fight, very often what the father will do is say, I'm going over to see Jenny, who's the mother of the other child. And this is a big source of conflict in the household. Yeah.
Was this the type of problem that you referred to in your previous slide? The statistic where you mentioned that a certain percentage of women had a problem, or a certain percentage of men had a problem. Like, was this the type of problem?
The distrust?
No, like in your previous slide, the distrust, and was this the case?
Yeah, so like in the first slide, it was sort of with this survey question that says, how do you, can you trust men to be faithful? How strongly agree, sort of agree, disagree, that's that kind of, so we did that. But this is sort of now based on these very in-depth interviews where we really get the details. So I think it's all about the same thing, but this qualitative data, which is also public, by the way, if you want to, you can get access to this data, these qualitative interviews. And it really gives you a sense of what's kind of the sexual conflict that's going on with the couples. So the bottom line there is that there is this instability and growing complexity over time. So remember, when we looked at the first verse, we saw that a lot of these women were having their first child out of wedlock while they were a teen. They have this child, they're not sure about the partner, they'd like to get married, they're hoping it works. But at the point at which they're hoping it works, they're also having the children. So here is what happens by age 5, by year 5. So you can see the first set of bars shows for the married, the cohabiting, the visiting, and the no relationship. So I'm back now to this 4-bar picture, 4-color picture. So you can see that 80% of the married couples at birth are still together after 5 years. I mean, that's not so encouraging in and of itself, but at least they're up there. About half of the cohabiting couples are still living together. Some of them have married, and about half of this group, about half of the yellow bar are now married, and half of them are still living together. Interestingly, about 30% of those couples that were just visiting at birth, so they were romantically involved but not married, they're now living together, and a smaller percent of them have actually gotten married. Very few people stay in this romantic but not living together status. It's a very fragile status, so nobody stays in that for very long. Then you can see in the next set that these are beginning new partnerships, that a lot of these parents have begun a new partnership, and a lot of these parents have had a child with a new partner. Here's just a little picture of showing the amount of instability during this 5-year period. So the first shows the mean number of changes in a residential partnership. So you can see on average, all of the non-marital, the mean for the unmarried parents is 1. They've either moved in or moved out. Another way of describing this is I used to do a lot of research on divorce, and people would always ask me, well, what if you had a single mom who never lived with any man? She was a single mom in a very stable relationship, or non-relationship, but how would her child turn out? Because I used to do research that suggested divorce had pretty negative effects on children. And the answer to that question is there are hardly any of those moms. Hardly any mom is a stable single mom. In the next set of bars, the relationship changes bars, looks at not whether they're moving in and out, but just the number of partners that the mother has. And you can see here for the visitors and the no relationship mom, the average number of partners they've had, romantic sexual partners in the 5-year period, is 3. So for some of them it's 0, a small amount. For some it's 1, but for some it's 14. So these are romantic relationships that are going on, and this sort of goes back to what I was sort of trying to say earlier about the complexity. So I think what's happens is that these mothers have the child, they sort of hope that this is going to work out. They're not willing to delay the pregnancy because they're not sure they'll ever get the man that they really want. So they go ahead and have the child, then the relationship ends, then they form a new partnership and have a second child. Whereas the educated women are waiting, they're finding the partner, and they're having their children with the same man, then maybe 2 children on average. These women, on average, are not having more than 2 children. That's an average with a very wide standard deviation. But they're having the children in the process of searching for the right partner. And this is creating an enormous amount of instability and complexity in the lives of these children. So the consequences for the parents, and here I'm just going to summarize, there's a lot of studies we've done to kind of look at all of these things. But basically, the fathers who don't marry, have lower earnings. We've got some evidence to show that these unmarried fathers, when they do get married to the mother, they do have higher earnings over the 5-year period. For the mothers, for the ones who are in these unstable relationships or who break up their relationship, they have higher poverty and more material hardship, which is sort of how often do you have to, your lights get turned off, or did you not be able to pay the rent, or sort of some kind of hardship like that. There's also a lot of evidence that the mothers have more depression, and that this is very related to the instability. So, for example, we can show that in the year in which the mother changes partners, there's like a shock to her depression score, which, if she doesn't change partners again, goes down after another 2 years. But the problem is a lot of women change again. And so every time there's a change, there's a shock to the mental health score. And so over time, all of this instability is creating a lot of depression and anxiety among the mothers. And then finally, these mothers with a lot of instability and complexity have lower social support. When we ask the parents about getting help from their family and friends, or would you have family that would loan you money, or would you do this, that, and the other, it turns out that the mothers in these complex households are less likely to be able to borrow money or get help from their parents. And again, this is related to the fact that when it's your grandchild, you're willing to help. But if there are 2 other kids there in that household that aren't your grandchild, you're a little less likely to want to help. And so this complex household sort of not only affects the amount of resources the mother has, but it affects the amount of instrumental and economic support she gets around her. So what we have is higher maternal stress, which turns out to be actually worse for the less educated moms. They're the most sensitive to the stress of the instability. Lower literacy activities, so less reading to the child, less playing games with the child, things that are cognitively stimulating. This activity, interestingly enough, is worse for the more educated moms. In general, it's the least educated moms who sort of experience the most anxiety and stress. But the more educated moms, or it's their kids who suffer the most in terms of parenting when the more educated mom has this unstable household. And then there's also more harsh discipline that's associated with this instability. And finally, for the child outcomes, we have evidence that there's more health problems in these families, more asthma in particular, which is interesting because asthma attacks are associated with stress, and it's very clear that there's a lot of stress in these households. They have lower cognitive skills, which would make sense given what's going on with the mothers spending time in the literacy activities. They have a lot more socio-emotional problems. There's more aggression and more attention deficit among the children, and that's very related both to being with a single parent, but also being related to this instability. And in particular, the outcomes seem to be worse for boys on the aggression and the attention. Now, again, we're just looking at kids when they're 5 years old. It's not clear whether the sort of negative effects on the girls are going to come out when they're teenagers, but that's what we're finding at age 5. So just a quick thing about what can be done, because I want to have time to talk, answer questions, but I think reducing the teen pregnancy is really important because, as you can see, about 60% of these single unmarried moms start as teenagers. So we shouldn't think that the teen pregnancy problem has gone away. A lot of people have sort of shifted in thinking that's pretty much been taken care of, but I don't think it has. Somehow we've got to figure out a way to encourage these women to delay the childbearing until they find a suitable partner. And a couple of ideas would be to provide some information about the advantages of two-parent families, which a lot of these parents don't seem to have, and also some incentives to delay. So I think the college-educated women, they are waiting now to get married. They're investing in their human capital. So they have to figure out a way to get these young, less educated, less advantaged women to also invest in their human capital. And there's a big debate about whether or not they have opportunities. What if it's not clear which comes first, whether they're not investing because of the lack of opportunity or whether they have no opportunities because they're not investing. And then just to mention here that there's this new movement to improve relationship skills. And the first set of programs are these marriage initiatives that have been around now for about 6 or 7 years, and they're really quite interesting. And the Mathematica Policy Research Company, which is out here in Princeton, are evaluating 6 research sites where they're intervening with these unmarried parents and trying to improve their relationship. And then also I've been hearing now about some more school-based initiatives that we're also working on improving the quality of the relationships. And here are funders, which I like to thank all the time. So that's it.
I know that there will be questions from this very active audience. We'll take them from students first for Professor McLanahan. The young lady in the striped shirt. Alex is bringing you the mic. There we go.
I was wondering whether in your research you ever found out about the effect of the involvement of the families of the mothers and the fathers in unmarried relationships in the rearing of the children. So, let me just give you an example. My cousin, she had a child in her teens. The husband, sorry, it's not husband, but the boyfriend, he is very active in the raising of the child. His family is very active in the raising of the child, and my cousin's family is also very active in the raising of the child. And I was wondering whether that, obviously, I believe that would have a positive effect on the child's raising, but did you do any research on that?
Well, we've done quite a bit of research on the father involvement and whether the father involvement with the child, benefits the child. And it looks like it really depends on what the nature of the relationship with the mother is. So if the father and mother get along and they agree on parenting, and they sort of share and they respect one another, then the involvement of the father has benefits. If the parents are fine every time he comes over, then it doesn't appear to have benefits. Which is the same in divorce and step families. It's pretty much the same. It really boils down in the end to the quality of the parents' relationship is so important here. And it's not just the romantic relationship. I mean, even when that romantic relationship is over, the parents being able to be respectful and to negotiate and to maintain a co-parenting relationship, if not a marriage, turns out to be very important for the child.
Yes, right next to.
Have you seen any preliminary results from the mathematical research on the marriage initiatives?
No, I haven't, but I'm hardly wait. So if they have, I think they have 6 sites they're doing, but it's really amazing. There's a guy named in Seattle, Washington, named John Gottman. Have any of you heard of him? Yeah? Some people have. Yeah. So a few years ago, they had this. He was on the front page of New York Times Magazine because they said if this guy videotapes you, you can tell it's 90% certainty whether you're going to get divorced. So he's very famous for studying couples and to tell you what the quality, noticing the quality of the relationship. So he has now gotten involved in this relationship building program, and his wife, they have developed a sort of model intervention program where it's almost like a kind of Oprah scene, where and you get 4 to 6 couples, and this unmarried couples come in, and there's a story like you would see on Oprah or one of these talk shows in the morning, and they discuss some issue, and then they get someone to come up and actually talk about it. So I have an ex-student, a former student, she's still my former student at the University of Texas, who's been watching a lot of these, and she said that parents love it. They just love that they've really been great in this intervention and coming up with really fun ways of getting the parents to talk about their relationships. And it's hard to get them to sign up for the programs. They don't like the idea, especially the men. But once they're there, they really do like it. And if you think about it, I mean, a lot of people object to these programs, or some of my colleagues in the sort of welfare group object to it on the basis that you're trying to force people to marry and you shouldn't be promoting marriage. But what I always say to them is relationship skills are good in lots of different domains. They can help you argue with your boss about a raise. They can help you in parenting. They can help you, even if you're not going to marry this person, once you're split up, they can help you get along. I mean, it's really just a basic skill of learning how to disagree, to state your position, to try to find some compromise, and to go forward. So I think the more relationship skills that we can teach young people, I can't imagine how that could be a good thing.
Young lady on the aisle here.
Hi, I recently read Promises I Can Keep for sociology class, just like 2 weeks ago. So I know I've been studying a lot of.
You read what? Promises I Can Keep?
Yes.
Yes.
And a lot of the mothers they talked to were Hispanic and very certain specific races and ethnic backgrounds, and also they were all very impoverished. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the class and the ethnic component of your study.
Yeah, well, this, I didn't really show you very much about this, but this is very, it goes with the education difference. You could see that 45% of these mothers did not have a high school degree. And that's very few white have no high school degree. So there's part of it's Hispanic and part of it's an immigrant phenomenon. Because the immigrants come with less education. But it's also related to this urban high school not finishing and dropping out of high school. So a lot of these parents are African American and Hispanic. That said, every everything I've shown you in terms of the gaps between the married and the unmarried, all those numbers I've looked at by race, ethnicity, as well as education. And the gaps are in almost every case, they're the same. They're a little narrower. So the gap between the father's earnings, say, between the married father and the father of the mother alone for a black and Hispanic is not quite as wide as it is for the whites. But it's always there. The marrieds are always doing much better than the unmarrieds. And the same thing in the, I've looked at these, what they say about the marriage and is it better for kids, and it's always the same pattern. Hispanics are the highest on the distrust. Hispanic women are the highest on the distrust.
Other questions? Before we get follow-ups, let's have someone new. Yes, this young man here.
I have two questions. First of all, you mentioned you were encouraged by the fact that 80% or so of children born to married or couples that were cohabiting.
50 cohabiting. The other 30 are romantic.
Oh yeah, sorry, that was 80%, right?
Yeah.
Do you think it just might be the fact that more of these people with more distant relationships and they're just visiting or no relation, I think it was, they're just aborting their babies at a higher rate? And the second question is, did you look at the role of religion? I was thinking this particularly when you're talking about infidelity and its impact.
Oh, that's a good question about the religion. Brad Wilcox has put these amazing religion questions into the study, so he can tell you more about that. Maybe Carol Ann can tell you something about religion. But in terms of the first question about the abortion rates, I don't think that that's really what is going on. I mean, I think probably that the abortion is higher when couples have no relationship. But a lot of these women don't like abortion, don't believe in abortion. You know, that sort of goes with the race ethnicity too. The blacks and Hispanics are less likely to have abortions than whites. And so I don't think that abortion is a big part of it. I think most of these children who are born, most of these non-marital pregnancies probably are to couples who have some relationship. I think actually when you think about this national statistics, I think about half of unintended pregnancies end in abortion. So it could be that abortion is pulling off the one. They would be pulling off the ones at the other end of the continuum. It's funny, if you ask these parents about their contraception, and that there's it's not clear. A lot of them will say they did not want to get pregnant, but then they'll say they weren't using contraception. So they're very ambivalent. They don't, they're not sort of like, okay, here's my plan. I want to have a child here. I'm going to use this contraception and this. They don't sort of think about it like that. It's more like, well, we didn't want to have a child, but we thought, well, maybe it's time or God will decide. And then once, and this is something that Kathy Eden makes a big point of in her promises I can keep, it's like, God gave me the baby and, I can do this. I can rise to this occasion and be a good mother. But they're not so sure they can be good. They can have a stable marriage. In fact, they're pretty sure they can, because everyone around them is, everybody they know that's married has gotten divorced. And they don't want a divorce. They think divorce is awful.
I'd like to ask a question and follow up on something you said near the end about delaying marriage. I think it was Brad Wilcox this morning who suggested to this audience of young people, don't delay getting married, don't put it off too long. And I think his suggestion was that the age range from 23 to 27 was was a healthy time to get married. You didn't give us a number, an age range, but I think you're talking about different populations. Most of your fragile families are young people having these out-of-wedlock births at younger ages, late teens, early 20s, that kind of thing. So when you say delay marriage, are you pushing into Brad's age range, or do you actually suggest pushing beyond 27, maybe to?
I think that the evidence suggests that delaying marriage after 25 or 26 doesn't have any benefits in terms of divorce.
Okay, so you're really in tune with Brad's numbers.
Yeah. But the problem is that, the idea that delaying marriage is going to pay off sort of is associated with the idea that you're going to get your act together and he's going to get his act together and you're going to get mature and then you're going to really settle down. And if you're not either one doing that, it's not just if you put these couples together at 25 in exactly the same situation they're in now, it's not clear that you would have a stable. Aging isn't what you just do, it's the maturity.
In the white sweater.
Hi. In terms of teen pregnancy, I've heard two arguments. One being that the couple should go ahead and get married and raise a child, and the other being that they should wait and build their relationship and then get married.
And then get married?
Or stay single. Or stay single. Stay separate. So, do you have any evidence to show whether the child care is better, whether parents staying separate or getting married?
Yeah, not in this study. Frank Furstenberg has written sort of a very famous book about teenage mothers, and he followed them for a long time. He started with the Baltimore study, and he found there was sort of a paradox. The mothers who got married and stayed married did the best. But the mothers who got married and got then divorced actually did the worst because they went on to have a second child with the guy, and then they got divorced. Whereas the women who didn't get married, they lived with their mother, and they went to school, intended to get more education, and then they did better. So there was this kind of, it's sort of if you can marry and make it work, that's the best. But if you marry and then it doesn't work out, you could actually be in a worse situation.
Over here. Right behind you, Alex.
I was really interested in the comparison between sort of the Swedish case and the findings that you found about the sort of cohabiting couples. And I wondered if you had any ideas about sort of why there was this stability in the Swedish case that does not exist here.
Well, I think the Swedish case, by the way, I've looked at, in every country that I've looked at, the industrialized countries, I've seen this education gradient. So it is even though it may not be as steep as it is in the U.S., in all the countries, it is the least educated women who are most likely to be. And that's stimulated quite a bit of arguments with some of my European friends because they like to say, oh, this is just the European way of doing things. And then I say, well, if it's just the European way, how come the most educated women aren't doing it that way? Because I think that's, the women with the most opportunities aren't choosing it that way. But in the Swedish case, these women are not so young. I mean, the Swedish women are they don't have very much teen pregnancy. So I think their relationships probably are more around the age of these, 24, 25. And in the marriage over there, as I understand it, France is the same way. There's some kind of, the not getting married has something to do with resisting religion, and it's resisting religion because religion is viewed as a state institution, in the government. So the religion, like in the U.S., we have the separation of church and state. Well, in those countries, they don't. And so a lot of the French don't want the Catholic Church telling them what to do. And so this is a way of kind of rebelling against what they see as a state-based religion. But it's not, we don't really have that in the U.S. because there is no state religion. And I think it's the same thing in Sweden, although I don't think of them as having a state-based religion, but there's some kind of, maybe there's some history in the Lutheran or something that
I think that's right.
yeah, so it does come for this, and it's, related to being sort of modern. You don't let the state tell you what to do. But it's really more about the state than it is the church. It just happens that the state is a single church.
All the Scandinavian countries have these very attenuated Lutheran establishments.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned that the empirical evidence for welfare programs and types of fostering these types is public policy entirely without fault in terms of perpetuating this, incentivizing certain, like stepping in times of economic downturn and actually over the long term. I remember coming across a study, Great Society legislation, New Deal legislation, that the effects on the family in terms of encouraging single-parent households.
Yeah, I probably overstated that a little bit. It's true that the empirical evidence on welfare benefits having a big effect is very weak. But my guess is that if you did a study, and I've never done this, but where you added up all kinds of policy things that are going on. So for instance, the earned income tax credit, if the mother is getting, if she's working, and she has to be working, she gets quite a large benefit. If the mother earns $12,000, she can be getting an extra $3,500 a year in earned income tax credit. And if she moves in with a man, or a man who lives with her, who puts her, really adds any earnings to the household, then she's going to lose those dollars. And then the same thing, you've got the food stamps, you've got Medicare, which low-income mothers are having access to this health insurance, which it's hard to, and people haven't really put a dollar value on that, but that's got to be huge. And then I think this whole incarceration and housing penalties. A lot of the single mothers live in subsidized housing, and if the father's not allowed to do that. So I don't think that the welfare story is nearly as conclusive as people might have suggested, but I think if you put all these policies together and look at the marriage penalties of a combination of health and income transfers, and I think it is true that the women at the very, very bottom are probably better off, and if the guy is not a good earner, they're probably economically better off without him. Although I must say, in the qualitative interviews, they're not talking like that. I mean, a lot of these mothers want to be with this guy. They just want him to stop fooling around, and they want him to settle down.
They want him to stop being the guy he is and be the guy
they
they want him
stop
to
being the guy he is.
be. Patricia.
I just have a question. You mentioned that you're starting these new programs to help relationships, to help foster positive relationships. I'm wondering,
In high schools?
I think you were talking about the marriage,
Yes.
helping the marriages together. And I'm just curious if this program is encouraging basically decrease in narcissism in these people, and in a sense, how do we approach this in a sort of hedonistic culture where we're constantly engaging our senses, which the previous speakers mentioned is a solitary experience, which is in a sense increasing our narcissism. So, any of your points of view?
Well, no, I don't really. You should go to this, if you're interested, go to Google, I think you just Google Building Strong Families, but if not that, go to this NPR.org. Anyway, it's Mathematical Policy Research. They're the big company that runs this. And they have a whole website for Building Strong Families. So I think, I don't think I don't think it has, the training programs have any kind of attempt at spirituality or non-hedonism. I think it's more, they're trying to increase communication skills. They're trying to teach people how to deal with their anger and how to communicate better. I mean, I know a lot of middle-class couples who've gone to programs like this. It's not totally different than group couples therapy. But it's not offered to poor couples, and it doesn't. How dramatic a change that makes in people's lives, I don't know. But I can imagine it having some effect on the margin.
Maggie?
Thank you. Might also go to smartmarriages.com for a general introduction to what these marriage education programs are about. I was struck by the question about differential in abortion as part of it. It was a great shock to find that so many of these unmarried mothers are in romantic relationships. And the tendency of women to be more likely to abort if they don't care for the father strikes me as one thing. But the other thing I found, I don't know if you've done any work on it, if you look at contraceptive failure rates, there's this enormous bump based on relationship status, particularly among women in their late teens or early 20s. So something like 30% of 20-year-old women report a contraceptive failure if they're cohabiting compared to, and I make these are on the order of, I don't know, they're not on the tips compared to 9% of women who are not young women who are not cohabiting. So you are. I wonder if that putting those two things together in terms of this great puzzle about why the increase in unmarried births, that it's the change in the norms about sex, which considerably antedated the change in the norms about family and unmarried motherhood, or at least it seems to me it came first. And that also, if you add in the education gradient, if people are going to be in extended non-marital careers, competence at the use of contraceptives, motivation at the use of contraceptives, your more educated, more intelligent people are going to be better and more successful at it. And they're also, if they get pregnant, they're more likely to have a partner who would be marriageable, although I don't know how many college-educated unwed pregnancies end up in marriage. I've never seen any work by education on legitimation rates. But if you begin with the idea that if people are going to have a lot of sex, a lot of pregnancies are going to happen, and then how do you explain the differentials and whether that results in an unmarried birth? I wonder if you might get farther towards explaining the puzzle than doing it from the reverse side of looking at why people choose to be, to be mothers.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's interesting is that U.S. isn't different from these other countries in terms of our sexual behavior. I mean, the teens in a bunch of these countries have as much sex as we do, but we have a lot more so-called unintended pregnancies, or mistakes, or contraceptive failures. I think, I don't know, and I think that is related to the whole titillation and the whole way our society is run. It's sex is this sort of thing you don't talk, it's. In Sweden, I think it's treated much more like a public health issue. It's like wearing a seatbelt.
I think we have time for, I'm sorry.
No.
I think we have time for one more question. Dr. Veely.
You say that it would be a good idea for some women anyway to wait till somebody better comes along. What would you say that somebody would say, well, look, at least with African American women who have the highest incidence of out-of-wedlock births, it's just not demographically feasible that there's so many black males who are, as Wilson says, not marriageable in jail. Is it reasonable to make that expectation that waiting is going to help their situation?
Well, I think that's the problem, and it's kind of the chicken and the egg too, right? The men were, the problem is would the men shape up if they were going to be married, So it's kind of, there's been this separation of, and the men are kind of living with their parents and their. So I do think that it's, having had kids myself, my son was a lot different at 24 than he was at 18. So I do think there's a certain amount of just maturing and, waiting. I think some guys do grow out of some of their behavior. I think it's a big issue is why these young women sort of don't see any future in kind of delaying pregnancy, and at least in finishing high school. And there's a big debate about whether or not they drop out of high school and then get pregnant, or they get pregnant and then drop out of high school. And a lot of people seem to think that really they just get tired of school, they disengage in school, and then they get pregnant. So it suggests that the pregnancy isn't what caused them to drop out of high school. So I think there is a non-trivial group of women out there that just seem to have no hope that getting more education or getting a little bit of work experience or that their lives would be better. Even if they're going to be single mothers, their lives would probably be better. I would think they would be better.
Well, there was much food for thought in this presentation and a very vigorous Q&A. So join me in thanking Dr. McLanahan.